Welcome to the pilot recording of My Rules Are Better. I'm Tom Barbalet, and I wanted in this pilot to give an outline of what this podcast is all about, talk a little bit about my podcasting history, and also give some indication of what's coming up in subsequent recordings. Because the aim of this podcast is to empower you, the listener, to create your own rules, to actually take from role-playing and wargaming and even potentially board games, the ability that you have as an individual to create your own rules and to actually own a rule set that you can work with socially, that you can engage with people, agree upon rules, perhaps multiple rules creators can come together and have agreed upon structures associated with how to create rules. Historically, and I went back and I looked at these books when I was 10, 11, 12 years of age, I wrote my own rule sets. I wrote my own rule sets primarily for role-playing games, but also wrote my own rule sets for board games. And it was incredibly empowering. And in later life, I've written my own rule sets for war games and written my own rule sets for board games and role-playing games. And I've continued this on in bits and pieces. But the underlying elements aren't actually that complicated. And I think it's important to look at creating rule sets based on a few mathematical patterns. Now, mathematics, typically, people hold up their hands, they shake their heads. It all seems too challenging, probability, dice, all this kind of stuff. I'm aiming to remove a lot of these obstacles in the methods that I describe through this podcast. But I also want to use this podcast as a means to do a certain degree of analysis. Why is it that rule sets in all these fields typically update? I mean, in war games and role-playing games in particular, there are constant updates of rule sets. In some cases, there's a move to extreme complexity. In other cases, there's a bunch of specialized rules. And these things revise typically in 2 to 3 year cycles. Now, one of the things that I love about this space is the amount of creative work that goes into creating worlds, creating miniature lines. All this kind of stuff is amazing. And I don't want this podcast necessarily to be a critique of the existing systems that are in place. It's more about empowering a group of people that have always wanted to create their own rule sets or been frustrated by various rule sets to enable them to create rule sets which may be simplified, they may be complicated, the choice is yours, but actually it's more a social thing. It's about bringing people together to play test various rule sets, and certainly through this podcast I'm going to talk about how you can create and playtest your own rule sets just as an individual before you actually take it out to a broader group of gamers. And the kinds of things that you should look for, because I think once you create your own rule sets, once you start looking at the various mechanics and what you're trying to do, length of time that you're looking to play, what kind of interactions you're looking to have, when you start exploring these things, you look at external commercial rule sets very differently. You look at them in a way which is not necessarily critical, but just says, I see what you're doing here. Oh, yeah, that's interesting. You're doing that there. You're doing this here. And I think what interests me, particularly with the immense creative talent that comes through these various spaces, is how we can empower a new generation, young kids, folks that wouldn't normally play these games to actually start interacting with these games. I do have a bit of history here, and I wanted to talk a little bit about my history before I started talking about my history of podcasts, which is a completely different thing. But historically, I have been fascinated by the broader and deeper history associated with both role-playing games and war games. And increasingly now, there are definitive histories that have been published. There are a variety of new histories that are coming out. There are people who are going out making documentaries. There's a bunch of YouTube-related stuff about the background to this thing. But I have historically participated in wargaming podcasts and broader things around this, so my voice might seem familiar in that light. But also, my longer-term background is associated with computer simulation. It's associated with mathematics, it's associated with complexity, it's associated with how these simulations are used. My primary simulation, Noble 8, was used by Apple and Intel. So, in terms of mathematics, I'm very well aware of how you create perspectives and realities and these kind of things. As a small boy, what interested me was creativity versus cost. I had limited access to money, but I had a wealth of time. I could write out rules. I had a group of friends that would be willing to play these rule sets, and this created a degree of freedom. I also grew up at a period of time where there was a book by Usborne Publishing called Write Your Own Fantasy Games, which was about taking D&D rules fundamentally, codifying them in what were microcomputers at the time, we're talking the mid-80s here, and then creating your own computer games from that. This is an empowerment thing for me. This is something that certainly motivated me to get out of Australia, to come over to the US, to spend time in the UK, to do everything I've done with my life has been codified within these very simple ideas. So I feel particularly impassioned associated with getting other folks into writing their own stuff, creating their own stuff as a means of creative expression, but also a means of just exploring, mathematical simulation space. For about 5-6 years, I hosted the Alien Star rule set. Now, Alien Star was a free wargaming rule set that covered a wide variety of areas, and this is something I wanted to actually touch upon. From skirmishes to large-scale battles to, one figure represents 100 figures to... There are so many different ways that you can cut and separate concepts in role-playing games, war games, and board games. So the way in which you approach this is oftentimes based on your own areas of interest. So if you like a particular range of figures, you like a particular style, either large-scale battles or skirmishes. I mean, the missing of skirmishes, the inability to play skirmishes with large-scale wargaming rules, and also, let's talk about role-playing as well. All these kind of things create, problems that aren't really there. What I loved about creating rules was that you return to very basic ideas of fairness, of competition. If your rules were not fair, if your rules were advantageous in particular areas, you wouldn't actually get a community playing your rules. And I think that's what's fascinating associated with what has come out of this community, is that now it's very standard. I mean, I lament what's happened on YouTube associated with particular companies just sending people stuff, giving them, rubber stamp reviews. Isn't this great? This is what's coming out, this kind of stuff. And within figure lines and these kind of stuff, I don't have any truck with that. I don't have any argument there. But I think what's interesting is if there are problems with the underlying rules and if rules break. So, for example, in wargaming, for folks that liked square-based fantasy, that whole thing has just disappeared. Unless you're part of the Oldhammer community, unless you're part of the half a dozen groups that are creating their own rule sets to fill the void of what Games Workshop did with regards to Age of Sigmar. So you've got all these things which are moving around the general topic for this podcast as well. And I don't necessarily want to get into reviewing rule sets and talking about underlying dynamics and this kind of stuff. It might become that later on. But early on, what I want to do is talk about experiences that I have had with various rules mechanics and how you can utilize these rules mechanics in a variety of different areas. We're going to talk about dice, obviously the 6-sided versus multi-sided dice, how you can use dice and various rolling techniques, pick the top one out of a roll of 3, add the dice together, above a certain level, these dice promote hits, this kind of stuff. All these kind of dice probability methods I'm going to explore with very simple mechanics. So the idea is not that you need to have a background knowledge in probability or mathematics in order to create your own rule sets. You just need to know that that mechanic works well in that situation. And that mechanic may work well in this situation. Or perhaps I should try this mechanic, but perhaps modify it to this mechanic. So what I'm going to do through this podcast is create comfort in the use of dice mechanics for a variety of different circumstances, and then talk about where you might use them in your own games. The beauty of framing this topic in this podcast, as I'm trying to do currently, is that you can cover a wide variety of different areas. Board games merit probably a number of podcast recordings in and of themselves. I'm going to move the board games a little bit further in the podcast series, just because it's something that I have done less of. But a lot of the techniques that we will discuss through the early parts of the podcast series will, I think, be incredibly useful for board games. What I want to talk about is framing, setting, genre. Obviously, if you're doing historical wargaming, for example, you're going to want to have some rough knowledge associated with the kinds of troops, the kinds of scenarios, perhaps what role terrain played, what role morale plays, all these kind of ideas. So you need to be at least slightly well-read. What I run currently is a role-playing game with heavy wargaming elements set in a post-apocalyptic universe of my own design. And that environment has enabled me to experiment with a number of the ideas that I want to talk about in this podcast. So I will have practical examples from my own life in here. And I've certainly gone back to the few books that I have from when I was 10 through to about 13 when I was creating my own games in this environment. Now, there is a great degree of flexibility associated with narrative. This is something I want to start this podcast series by highlighting, that if you have a good narrative, you can work around a variety of rather curious mechanics. And in fact, if you're starting with very simple mechanics, the strength of the narrative will create a better feeling with the players as you continue to explore game mechanics and things that you're working on that I'm going to identify through this podcast series. So that is, in a nutshell, where this thing has come from. I wanted to talk a little bit about who I am in terms of podcasting. I have been podcasting for about 12 years now. I started in 1996. I've recorded on a wide variety of podcast topics. I periodically have appeared, historically maybe 10 years ago, associated with wargaming in certain circumstances, and I've appeared in various video game podcasts and a variety of other spaces. I mean, I've lent my ideas and voice and techniques, for want of a better term, to a variety of different podcasts. But in terms of the podcasts that I've actually recorded, I've recorded roughly 10 podcasts, of which have had various lifespans. The longest running podcast, which has yielded the most success, is a podcast called Model Rail Radio, which is about the model railroading hobby. And that has gone on since 2009. It has a substantial international audience. I take callers. It's a call-in show, basically, about the hobby of model railroading. And I take callers from all over the world who are talking passionately about the model railroading hobby. One point that I will make is that I'm not going to take sponsors for this podcast. I don't take sponsors for any of my podcasts. Sponsors provide headaches, which you don't need. And in the case of what I'm trying to do here, sponsorship would only create problems associated with the kinds of narratives and ideas that I want to be putting out through this podcast. So historically, I've never taken sponsorship with my podcast. I've occasionally appeared on podcasts that have taken sponsorship. Sometimes that's created interesting problems. But what I want to do here is produce free, periodic content that I hope will be incredibly useful for you. And what I'm looking for is listener feedback. One of the things about not taking sponsorship is it's all about word of mouth. Word of mouth is incredibly important when you're producing free podcasts. So what I would like to empower you to do, if you like the content, the pilot doesn't need to be enough for you to do what you need to do in terms of word of mouth. If you've listened to a few recordings within this podcast feed and you like what you're hearing, please do recommend this podcast to other people, because that is incredibly important. Now, in addition to Model Rail Radio, I had a long-standing podcast with a linguist in LA called Heron Stone. The podcast was called Stone Ape. It went on for about 7 years. I've recorded a podcast called Biota, which was associated with the simulation projects that I've worked on with Noble Ape and others have worked on as well, which was more associated with academics calling in and talking, also some hobbyist simulators, talking about the, various aspects of the simulations. I record a podcast called Long Funk, which is a follow-on podcast to another podcast that I recorded, which was called Short Funk. Short Funk was typically 5 to 7 minutes. Long Funk is typically 10 to 20 minutes worth of ideas, just recorded in single podcast form. The longest podcast from the start was probably the Biota podcast. I've also recorded a podcast called Ape Reality, which has been about my Noble Ape simulation. But that has kind of fallen off because I talk about Noble Ape through Long Funk. The number of people that actively use Noble Ape is a relatively small community, and I can communicate with them organically through a variety of other means. So I also have a YouTube channel called Monty's Reviews, which I do periodic reviews associated with miniature painting, rule sets, unboxings, the usual YouTube-related stick, although I don't take freebies. I pay money for stuff in order to unbox them. So maybe I'll point to Monty's Reviews at some time if I need to actually bring visuals into this thing. I'm going to try to minimize the amount of tables and the amount of mathematics that needs to be in this podcast. What I'm going to do is describe things, refer back to the website. You can look at the website, very simple mathematical tables. But really what I'm looking for here is a means of describing the dynamics, the dice methods that I'm using as words which are comfortably usable, associated with whether things are more likely or less likely to occur, this kind of stuff. I'm still working on the exact details for this part of the podcast. So if you're listening to the pilot and you see more podcasts in the feed, the more podcasts in the feed are probably going to describe things better than I have been able to do here. But I wanted to keep the pilot relatively short. I wanted to give a brief indication of the stuff that I'm going to be trying to tackle with this podcast, with the view that the podcast will define itself in subsequent episodes. So thank you very much for listening to the pilot. Thank you very much for putting up with me. I'm currently recording in San Jose, California, where I have a podcasting room that is filled with a variety of different things that I will utilize through these recordings, be it historical rules, be it historical accounts, be it countless historical white dwarfs, let me say that out loud, and a bunch of other magazines and books and miscreant stuff, and of course miniatures and dice. So I'm looking forward to creating this thing as a luxury for you to listen into, and I'm going to try not to get too technical. If I get too technically bogged down, please feel free to reach out to me. My email address, I'll just give you my direct one. It's Barbalet, which is my surname, Barbalet, or sometimes I say it in military speak, Bravo Alpha Romeo, Bravo Alpha Lima Echo Tango, @gmail.com. That's the one that's read by the CIA, easy to access. So if you can email me, if you have ideas, if you have feedback, if you want certain rule dynamics or rule sets even looked at critically, please feel free to do that. This is as much your podcast as it is mine. Thank you very much for listening into the pilot.